The California sun beat down on the Warner Brothers lot like a spotlight, casting sharp shadows across the bustling studio grounds. It was mid-afternoon in March 1955, and the set of East of Eden hummed with the controlled chaos that defined Hollywood productions. Electricians adjusted lights, makeup artists darted between actors, and production assistants scurried with coffee and script changes. The air hung heavy with cigarette smoke, the scent of hot camera equipment, and the unmistakable tension that preceded an important scene. James Dean stood off to the side, away from the commotion. At 24, he was still relatively unknown to the general public, though whispers about his talent had already begun to circulate throughout the industry. Dressed in the simple clothes of his character Cal Trask, worn jeans, a light button-down with rolled sleeves, he appeared unassuming. Yet there was something magnetic about his presence, the way he held himself slightly apart from everything around him, as if viewing the world through a lens only he possessed. Director Elia Kazan watched Dean from across the soundstage. He had fought to cast the young actor against studio wishes, seeing in him something raw and untamed that couldn't be taught at any acting school. Dean had already established a reputation for being difficult, showing up late, questioning direction, improvising beyond the script. But Kazan understood that behind this behavior lay a wellspring of emotion that, if properly channeled, could translate into cinematic gold. "Places in 5 minutes," the assistant director called out, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Dean nodded almost imperceptibly before turning away. He moved to a quiet corner where a wooden chair sat beneath a small window. Settling into it, he pulled a dog-eared copy of the script from his back pocket, though he hardly needed to review his lines. This scene, the confrontation with his screen father, Raymond Massey, had been living in his mind for weeks. Julie Harris, Dean's co-star who played Abra, approached cautiously. Unlike many on set who found Dean's methods perplexing or frustrating, she had developed a quiet understanding with him. "Ready?" she asked, her voice gentle. Dean looked up, his blue-gray eyes momentarily vulnerable before the wall came back up. "Yeah," he said, the word barely audible. "Just getting there." Harris nodded, understanding what he meant. Dean wasn't simply memorizing lines or blocking. He was sinking into the emotional quicksand of his character's life, a young man desperate for his father's approval, living in the shadow of a favored brother, bearing the weight of rejection. For Dean, this wasn't just acting. It was excavation of his own buried pain. "You'll be brilliant," she said simply, then left him to his process. The truth that few on set fully grasped was how deeply the story of Cal Trask resonated with Dean. Born in Marion, Indiana, he had lost his mother to cancer when he was 9 years old. His father, unable or unwilling to raise him afterward, had sent him to live with his aunt and uncle in Fairmount. That sense of abandonment, of being unwanted by the one person who should have wanted him most, had shaped the contours of his short life. On the other side of the set, Raymond Massey reviewed his own lines, his approach to acting as different from Dean's as possible. A classically trained veteran of stage and screen, Massey believed in the craft of acting, technique, discipline, precision. Dean's improvisational style and emotional volatility confounded him. The tension between them wasn't just acting, it was the collision of two fundamentally different approaches to the same art form. Kazan had noticed this friction from the beginning, and rather than trying to smooth it over, had deliberately stoked it. He had pulled Massey aside early in production and suggested he maintain his distance from Dean off-camera to preserve the authentic antagonism between father and son that the script demanded. Method directing to complement method acting. "Everyone to their places," the assistant director called again, more insistently this time. The set quieted as crew members took their positions. Camera operators checked their equipment one last time, while boom mic handlers adjusted their angles. The scene would take place in the family living room, a meticulously designed set with period-appropriate furniture, wallpaper, and decor capturing the early 20th century Salinas Valley setting of Steinbeck's novel. Dean rose from his chair, rolling his shoulders and shaking out his hands as if physically dispelling any remnants of himself, making room for Cal Trask to take over. He walked onto the set with a changed posture, slightly hunched, as if perpetually braced for rejection. Kazan approached him for a final word before the cameras rolled. "Remember," the director said quietly, This is about more than anger. It's about longing. Cal wants what he can never have, his father's unconditional love. Dean nodded, his eyes already distant, already elsewhere. Kazan recognized the look. Dean was no longer fully present. He was halfway to becoming someone else. "Action in 60 seconds," came the call. The lights adjusted, casting the set in the warm glow of a California afternoon. The scene was set in the aftermath of Cal's business venture, an attempt to make money growing beans during World War I, a scheme intended to win his father's approval by recouping losses from a failed refrigeration project. Massey took his position by the window, his posture rigid, embodying the moral inflexibility of Adam Trask. Harris waited in the wings for her cue to enter later in the scene. The script supervisor held the screenplay open, ready to note any deviations. Sound rolling. Camera rolling. The clapperboard snapped shut. Action. The transformation was immediate and total. Dean wasn't acting. He was inhabiting. His eyes, normally guarded, now exposed every vulnerability as Cal. He moved into the room with the hesitant enthusiasm of someone bearing a gift they're not sure will be accepted. "I want to give you something," Dean as Cal said, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and anxiety as he approached Massey. "I made it all for you." The scene proceeded according to script, Cal explaining his business venture, his father's cold reception of what he perceived as war profiteering, the growing tension between their moral worldviews. But something was happening beneath the dialogue, something electric and unscripted. Dean was bringing more to each line than was written on the page, infusing Cal's desperation with layers of his own unresolved yearning. Off camera, Kazan watched intently, sensing the gathering emotional storm. The scene called for anger, for Cal to react with frustration to his father's rejection. It was supposed to be a heated exchange, not a breakdown, but Dean was veering from the expected path, following some internal emotional compass. As the scene built toward its climax, the air in the studio seemed to change density. Crew members who had seen hundreds of scenes filmed felt it, that rare sensation when fiction gives way to something authentic and unplanned. The camera operator tightened his focus on Dean's face, instinctively knowing that whatever was about to happen shouldn't be missed. The crucial moment approached. Adam Trask's rejection of Cal's money, his gift, his attempt at connection. Massey delivered the line with all the patriarchal disappointment it required. "Do you think I could take that money? I'd rather burn it." Something flickered across Dean's features, a momentary breach in the dam holding back waters too powerful to contain. His breathing changed, becoming shallower, more ragged. The script called for him to respond with defiance, with the anger of the perpetually rejected son. But as the cameras continued to roll, capturing every micro-expression, it became clear to everyone watching that the scene was about to transcend the boundaries of the screenplay. The afternoon light slanted through the windows of the set, casting Dean's face in a golden glow that highlighted the subtle trembling of his lips, the increasing brightness in his eyes. He was standing at the threshold of a moment that would later be discussed in film schools and acting workshops for decades to come. The moment when James Dean stopped performing pain and simply allowed himself to feel it. This first chapter sets the scene for the emotional breakdown that will occur in Chapter 2. I've focused on establishing the historical and cultural context of 1950s Hollywood while building the emotional foundation for Dean's unexpected vulnerability on camera. I've incorporated authentic details about the Warner Brothers studio lot in 1955, the filmmaking process and set dynamics of the era, James Dean's real background and personal struggles that parallel his character, the tension between different acting approaches, method acting versus classical, director Elia Kazan's actual techniques and relationship with his actors, the genuine dynamics between Dean and his co-stars. The tension in the air crystallized as Dean stood before Massey, the cameras capturing every flicker of emotion across his face. The script pages trembled slightly in the grip of the script supervisor, who sensed, as everyone did, that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "I'm sorry, Father." Dean's voice emerged different than in rehearsals, softer, younger somehow. The practiced defiance was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable. Massey continued with his scripted line, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in his young co-star. "You're not sorry. You're only sorry because you got caught." It was then that the first crack appeared. Dean's eyes, normally so careful even in their calculated intensity, began to glisten. A slight tremor passed through his jaw. Those closest to the action noticed his hands, always so expressive, begin to shake. The cinematographer instinctively tightened his focus, drawn to the raw emotion emanating from the young actor. Dean attempted to deliver his next line, but the words caught in his throat. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across Massey's face. This wasn't how they had rehearsed the scene. Kazan, from his position behind the camera, leaned forward but made no move to call cut. Something primal in his director's instinct told him to let the cameras roll. "You never wanted me," Dean finally said, the line from the script transformed by the emotion now saturating his voice. But the words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the character of Cal Trask. They carried the weight of Marion, Indiana, of a 9-year-old boy packing a small suitcase, of a father who had chosen absence. What happened next transcended acting. As Massey delivered his line about preferring his other son, something inside Dean broke open. His shoulders hunched slightly as if physically struck. Then, contrary to everything written in the script, tears welled in his eyes and spilled down his cheeks. "Cut," whispered the assistant director reflexively, but Kazan held up his hand. A silent command to continue filming. The crew froze, barely breathing. This wasn't in the script. Dean was supposed to respond with anger, with the rebellion that defined his character and, to some extent, his public persona. Instead, he was crying, openly and without restraint in a way that men in 1955, especially men on camera, simply didn't do. Dean's sobs were not the theatrical tears of practiced emotion, but the jagged, uneven sounds of genuine grief. His breaths came in uneven gasps as years of carefully constructed defenses crumbled under the weight of the moment. The parallels between his life and Cal's, both seeking approval from fathers who couldn't or wouldn't give it, had finally collapsed into one another. Massey, a consummate professional but unprepared for this departure from the script, hesitated briefly before continuing with his lines. Something in the older actor's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a momentary glimpse of the man behind the character responding with genuine concern to the pain before him. Kazan watched, transfixed, as the scene transformed into something he couldn't have directed if he'd tried. This was the essence of what he had always sought in his actors. Truth so potent it blurred the line between performance and reality. He had pushed Dean throughout the production, sensing the depths beneath the surface, but even he hadn't anticipated this complete dissolution of the barrier between actor and character. Dean struggled to regain his composure enough to continue the scene. Tears streamed freely down his face now, catching the studio lights. His breathing was uneven, shoulders shaking with each sob, yet somehow he found Cal's next line. "I've been bad. I've been awful bad. I'm awful sorry." The words emerged broken, barely audible, infused with a nakedness that made some crew members avert their eyes, feeling suddenly like intruders witnessing something too private for public consumption. In that moment, the artifice of filmmaking, the lights, the cameras, the painted sets, seemed to fade away. What remained was a young man confronting ghosts he'd carried since childhood, his mother's early death from cancer, his father sending him away to be raised by relatives in Fairmount, the persistent feeling of being unwanted that had followed him from Indiana to Hollywood. Julie Harris, watching from the sidelines, pressed a hand to her mouth. She had glimpsed Dean's hidden vulnerabilities during their conversations, but this was different. A complete surrender to the pain he usually kept carefully contained behind rebellion and practiced indifference. The cinematographer, sensing the historic nature of what was unfolding, made subtle adjustments to ensure every tear, every tremor was captured. This wasn't just a scene anymore. It was a document of raw human emotion rarely seen on film in that era. As the scene continued, Dean somehow navigated through his breakdown, finding his way back to the script while incorporating his genuine emotion. His tears became part of Cal's reality, transforming the character from the angry young rebel of Steinbeck's novel into something more complex and heartbreaking. When Kazan finally called cut, the silence that followed was absolute. For several seconds, no one moved. Dean remained standing center stage, tears still flowing, seemingly unable to step back from the emotional precipice he had crossed. The boundary between James Dean and Cal Trask had dissolved completely. Kazan approached him slowly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, a gesture of both professional respect and human concern. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The director guided Dean off the set, away from the staring eyes of the crew, giving him space to reassemble the pieces of himself that had broken open. As they disappeared behind the set, whispers began to ripple through the crew. What they had just witnessed wasn't supposed to happen in professional filmmaking. Actors, especially male actors in 1950s Hollywood, were expected to simulate emotion, not experience it so viscerally that it overtook the scene. But everyone present understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment of genuine human truth captured on film, a glimpse behind the carefully constructed facade of James Dean to the wounded soul beneath. In an industry built on illusion, they had just seen something real, and the cameras had caught it all. The soundstage remained unnaturally quiet after Dean and Kazan disappeared behind the set. The typical bustle of a film crew between takes, the casual chatter, the technical adjustments, the shuffle of equipment, was conspicuously absent. Instead, the 30-odd people who had witnessed Dean's breakdown stood in a collective daze, as if waking from a shared dream. Jerry Carlson, the veteran cinematographer who had captured it all, remained hunched behind his camera, one hand still resting on the equipment. In 23 years of filming, he had never seen anything like what had just transpired. He had worked with the greats, Bogart, Hepburn, Grant, professionals who delivered emotion on cue without sacrificing their composure. What Dean had done was different. It wasn't acting anymore. It was confession. "Did you get it?" whispered his assistant, breaking the silence. Carlson nodded slowly. Every frame. His voice held a reverence usually reserved for religious experiences. In many ways, what they had witnessed was a form of communion, the sacred moment when artifice falls away and something true emerges. Across the set, the sound engineer removed his headphones, his face ashen. Through the sensitive equipment, he had heard every nuance of Dean's breakdown, the subtle catches in his breath before the tears came, the ragged edge to each sob, the tremor in his voice that no actor could fake. It had been almost too intimate to bear, listening to the private pain of another human being laid so bare. Julie Harris stood motionless, her script forgotten in her hands. She felt a complicated mix of emotions. Concern for Dean, certainly, but also a profound respect for what he had surrendered to the moment. As an actress trained in the same method techniques, she understood the courage it took to access such vulnerable places, especially under the merciless gaze of a camera. "Has anyone ever?" began a young production assistant, but the question died on his lips, unnecessary. Everyone knew the answer. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when the carefully constructed walls between actor and character had not merely thinned, but collapsed entirely. Raymond Massey emerged from the set looking visibly shaken. The veteran actor had built a career on control and technique, approaching each role with meticulous precision. Dean's raw emotional display had caught him completely off guard, forcing him to respond not as Adam Trask but as himself, a fellow human being witnessing another's pain. "I didn't know," he said quietly to no one in particular. "I didn't know he would—" He trailed off, unable to articulate exactly what had happened. It wasn't simply that Dean had cried. Actors cried on cue all the time. It was the quality of those tears, genuine, unscripted, torn from some deep well of personal anguish that had left Massey uncharacteristically speechless. The script supervisor closed her notebook, her hands trembling slightly. The scene had deviated so dramatically from the written word that her notes seemed suddenly irrelevant. What they had captured went beyond dialogue and stage direction. It existed in a realm where the technical aspects of filmmaking gave way to pure emotional truth. "Should someone check on him?" asked the makeup artist, her professional concern for continuity mingling with personal worry. Dean's face would be visibly affected by the tears. Eyes reddened, skin blotched, making the next scenes challenging to match. "Give him space," said the assistant director, finding his voice at last. Though young, he had worked with Kazan enough to understand the director's approach. Elia knows what he's doing. Behind the set, in a small dressing room that smelled of grease paint and cigarettes, Dean sat hunched on a wooden chair, his face buried in his hands. Kazan stood nearby, neither speaking nor touching, simply maintaining a presence that acknowledged what had occurred without demanding explanation. Dean's shoulders had stopped shaking, but the aftershocks of his emotional earthquake still reverberated through his body. Opening up like that, exposing the raw nerve of his own abandonment issues before a crew of 30 people and the unblinking eye of a camera, had left him feeling both emptied and strangely cleansed. Kazan finally broke the silence. "That," he said quietly, "was the truest moment I've ever seen on film." Dean looked up, his face tear-streaked, eyes red-rimmed but clear. The vulnerability that had overwhelmed him moments ago hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, a kind of weary acceptance. "It wasn't acting," Dean admitted, his voice hoarse. Kazan nodded. "I know." A knock on the door interrupted them. The assistant director poked his head in, his expression a careful blend of professional deference and personal concern. "The crew is wondering about the schedule," he said. "Should we break for the day?" Kazan looked to Dean, giving him the choice. The young actor drew a deep breath, ran his hands over his face, and straightened his shoulders. "No," he said with a resolve that surprised even him. "I can finish." Back on the sound stage, the word spread quickly that filming would continue. The spell of stunned silence began to break as crew members returned to their responsibilities, though the typical between-takes banter remained subdued. Something fundamental had shifted in the collective atmosphere, a newfound reverence for the process they were part of, for the raw humanity they had been privileged to witness. The makeup artist approached Dean as he re-entered the set, her kit ready to address the physical evidence of his tears. With gentle professionalism, she dabbed at his face, applying subtle touches to maintain continuity with earlier shots. But she couldn't fully erase what had happened. The emotional residue remained visible in his eyes, adding a new dimension to every subsequent scene. As preparations resumed for the next shot, whispered conversations broke out among small clusters of crew members, each processing what they had seen in their own way. "I've never felt like that watching a scene before," confessed a lighting technician to his colleague. "Like I was seeing something I shouldn't be seeing." "That wasn't in the script," the boom operator muttered to the sound engineer. Where did that come from?" In the corner, the film editor who had been observing the day's shoot made notes with newfound intensity. He already knew that the footage they had captured would require special handling, not technical tricks or clever cuts, but a gentle, reverential approach that would preserve the raw authenticity of Dean's breakdown. By the time Kazan called for positions, a strange new energy had settled over the set, a mixture of professional focus and emotional awareness. Everyone moved with heightened intention, as if they had collectively crossed some threshold into a more meaningful dimension of their craft. As the cameras prepared to roll again, Dean took his mark, outwardly composed but internally transformed. What had been exposed could not be hidden again. What had been revealed would forever change how he approached not just this role, but every role to follow in his tragically short career. The clapperboard snapped shut, the red light on the camera glowed, and the silence that had gripped the crew gave way to the sacred hush of witnesses to something rare and precious, the moment when art transcends technique to touch the truth of human experience. In the darkened editing room at Warner Brothers Studios 3 weeks later, cigarette smoke hung in thin layers illuminated by the light of the moviola. Film editor Owen Marks hunched over the machine, his experienced fingers gently handling the delicate strips of celluloid containing Dean's breakdown. Beside him sat Elia Kazan, watching intently as the footage rolled through the viewer for the 5th time that evening. "Most directors would cut it," Marks said, breaking the silence. "Too raw, too real." He paused the machine on a frame that captured Dean's tears in perfect clarity, vulnerability, frozen in time. "It breaks every rule in the book." Kazan leaned back in his chair, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "That's exactly why we're keeping it." In Hollywood's carefully controlled studio system of 1955, emotional authenticity was typically sacrificed for technical perfection. Tears were glycerin, applied by makeup artists moments before the camera rolled. Emotions were performed rather than experienced, calibrated to match the lighting and framing. Dean's unscripted breakdown represented everything the system was designed to avoid: the messiness of genuine human feeling, the unpredictability of real emotion. "Jack Warner might fight you on this," Marks cautioned, referring to the notoriously controlling studio head. "Let him," Kazan replied with the confidence of a director who understood the power of what they had captured. "Some things are worth fighting for." Meanwhile, across town at Chateau Marmont, James Dean sat alone on the balcony of his room, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the lights of Hollywood below. The weeks since the breakdown had been strange, marked by a new vulnerability that both unsettled and liberated him. Something had shifted that day on set. Some barrier between his carefully constructed public persona and his private pain had dissolved, leaving him feeling oddly exposed, yet strangely unburdened. News of what had happened had spread through the industry with the speed of whispered gossip. On studio lots and in commissary lunches, actors and directors discussed the young man who had cried real tears on camera, some with admiration, others with professional disdain for what they considered a breach of technique. "That's not acting," veteran actor Joseph Cotton had reportedly said when told of the incident. "That's therapy." But others in the emerging methods school saw it differently. At the Actors Studio in New York, Lee Strasberg discussed Dean's breakdown as the ultimate expression of their philosophy, the complete emotional identification of actor with character, the transformation of personal pain into artistic truth. Back in the editing room, Kazan and Marks continued their work, carefully building the scene around Dean's raw emotion. Rather than hiding the breakdown, they made the bold decision to emphasize it, holding the close-up longer than convention dictated, allowing the audience to witness every nuance of Dean's pain. "We're going to change the score here," Kazan said, making notes for composer Leonard Rosenman. "Strip it back. Nothing orchestral, just something simple, something that doesn't tell the audience what to feel." Marks nodded in agreement. In an industry that often used music to manufacture emotion, Kazan's choice to let Dean's performance stand largely unadorned was revolutionary, a testament to his faith in the power of what they had captured. "The sound mix needs to be perfect," Kazan continued. "Every catch in his breath, every hesitation. I want the audience to feel like they're in that room with him, witnessing something real." As April turned to May and production on East of Eden wrapped, the legend of Dean's breakdown continued to grow. During early screenings for studio executives, that scene became the focal point of discussions. Some argued it was too intense for mainstream audiences accustomed to the polished performances of traditional Hollywood. Others recognized it as a watershed moment, a glimpse of cinema's future where emotional authenticity would become as important as technical perfection. On April 10, 1955, East of Eden premiered at the Astor Theater in New York. The audience, expecting simply another Hollywood adaptation of a Steinbeck novel, was unprepared for the emotional impact of Dean's performance. When the breakdown scene played, the theater fell into the same stunned silence that had gripped the set months earlier. It was as if 1,400 people collectively held their breath, witnessing not an actor portraying pain, but a human being experiencing it. The reviews that followed recognized something extraordinary had occurred. The New York Times called Dean's performance a revelation in cinematic emotional honesty, while Variety described the breakdown scene as among the most powerful moments ever committed to film. What had begun as a potential mistake, an actor losing control, had been transformed into the film's defining achievement. For Dean himself, the impact was complicated. The scene's power helped catapult him to sudden stardom, but it also forever linked his professional identity with his personal pain. In the mere months of fame he would enjoy before his fatal car crash in September 1955, interviewers repeatedly asked about that moment, forcing him to revisit the vulnerability he had exposed. "I just became Cal," he would say simply, reluctant to dissect the alchemy that had occurred that day. How could he explain that, in that moment, the boundary between James Dean from Marion, Indiana, and Cal Trask from Salinas Valley had completely dissolved? That the tears were simultaneously for a fictional father's rejection and a real one's absence? In the decades that followed, long after Dean's death, that scene would be studied in film schools and acting workshops as a benchmark of emotional performance. Directors would cite it when pushing their actors toward greater authenticity. Acting teachers would analyze it as the perfect fusion of technique and genuine feeling. What no one could fully recreate, however, was the perfect storm of circumstances that had made it possible. A young actor carrying unresolved personal trauma, a director wise enough to recognize authentic emotion when it appeared, and a crew sensitive enough to preserve the sacred space in which it unfolded. On the night of the Academy Awards in March 1956, when Dean received a posthumous nomination for his role in East of Eden, a brief clip of the breakdown scene played for the audience. Even in that small excerpt, the power of what had been captured was undeniable, a moment of human truth that transcended acting to become something universal and timeless. In that darkened theater, as millions watched on television, the industry that had initially been unsure how to categorize Dean's breakdown finally recognized it for what it was. Not a mistake that had fortuitously worked out, but a masterpiece born from the courage to be authentically vulnerable in an art form often built on illusion. The tears that weren't in the script had become, in the end, the most indelible words James Dean ever spoke on screen.